Good morning. Today with us we have Professor Stefan Bauberger, who has come to us from Munich. Professor works at the University of Munich, and his main areas of specialization include theoretical physics and philosophy of nature. He's particularly interested in the theory of time and the issues related to time. Professor Bauberger is also a Jesuit and a Zen master. He runs his own retreat center near Munich. Today, Professor is going to speak to us about different types of knowledge and mindfulness.
So I will talk about what is scientific knowledge, and this topic is important in that sense that we live in a society which is deeply shaped by scientific knowledge and also by a scientific worldview. I would say even those who want to resist this scientific worldview, they are in a position of resisting this scientific worldview. So they are contrary to this scientific worldview, and also their worldview is somehow comes or relates to that scientific worldview. I'm a religious person, as you have heard also, and of course as a religious person I also have to relate to this scientific worldview. And my experience is that sometimes from a religious position, but also from a position, for example, of artists, this relation to scientific worldview is too simple and is more a sort of adapting to this worldview and finding some places to hide where this worldview does not expand to. And I think this is a too simple approach. I think it's better to understand this scientific worldview and then to relate to it from a position of understanding. Yeah. So I've also studied physics and even worked in physics. So I'm somehow I can relate to this scientific work and to this worldview. I relate now to philosophy. Some of the first philosophers in Greece, who developed the theory of atomism. Maybe most of you know that in early Greece already there has been this idea that matter is composed of very small particles, atoms. They did not have anything to show that these atoms exist, but it was a very intelligent theory at that time. And as you know, it has proven true meanwhile, this theory of atomism. And some of the early philosophers, Leucippus and Democritus, are very much known. They developed this theory of atomism, and for them it was the idea that you can gain true knowledge beyond the perception of the senses. They started to distinguish what the senses are experiencing, and they said, but behind the real reality, behind that is another reality. The atoms, they said. This is the reality. But we perceive colors, and we smell something, and we touch something, and all this perception of the senses. But these perceptions are not the real reality. This is only the reality as it is shown to us through the senses. And so the idea was to look behind this and to look at the reality as it is. And this was the program of science already. It was later on philosophers of empiricism, they distinguished between primary and secondary qualities of matter. They said the primary qualities is that what is perceived by science, and the secondary qualities is that what is perceived by the senses, but the secondary qualities arise from the primary qualities. And if we want to understand reality as it is, if we want to understand matter, then we need science in order to come to the first qualities of the objects that we perceive. Again, the program of science. And as you know, this program is extremely successful, and we are living in an environment which is shaped by technical stuff all around us, here in this room, but also in our life. We are always surrounded by technical stuff, and in that sense, this science is something which surrounds us and which shapes very much our way of living and of being in the world, and also this view of science of the world. And of course, the problem arises if whether this view shows all of reality. And as I said, for example, artists and religious people protest against this and say, no, there is something more in reality than that what science shows us about reality. And I want to talk about this, what it means that there could be something more than that which science shows to us. First again, about the program of this scientific worldview, that which, when we talk about this primary and secondary qualities of matter, of the objects, then this involves that there are objective qualities and subjective qualities. The secondary qualities which our senses show to us are subjective qualities. They are formed by us, by our senses, and also they are formed in an individually different way. And science goes for objective qualities, which are independent of the observer. That is what makes, of course, the quality, the specific way of knowledge of science. For example, in literature or in other kinds of approaches to reality, there is not such an objectivity. Even in history, it is very much debated whether there can be a full objectivity. But for science, this is the program. And the scientific worldview claims that only objective knowledge is real knowledge, and subjective knowledge is not real knowledge. And my program is to show that this claim cannot be held, that the scientific knowledge is wonderful. As I said, I've been working as a scientist, and I really appreciate very much scientific knowledge. It is wonderful, but it is only one approach to reality. So, and I try to develop this program on some levels that show how science approaches reality and how science perceives reality. I will take a sort of an idea which is developed by which has been developed by the German philosopher Kant, very well known philosopher, I think. And Kant, he says that human perception of reality always comes in some form. So it is not an independent, not a real objective knowledge, but it is always knowledge in some form. And I would say science is a specific form of knowledge, and this form is a sort of perspective on reality. In its perspective, it is perfect, and there is nothing missing in this perspective. So there is nothing which should be excluded from scientific research. Even now, when they try to find out what is thinking, brain research, all this is wonderful, but it will only perceive the reality in its specific form. And this form has several characteristics which I want to show up now. One is that the theoretical knowledge is considered more important than the practical knowledge. Practical knowledge is the knowledge how to move around in the world, how to do things, all this. And science strives for theoretical knowledge. There are some researches that show that, for example, among physicists, I've been a theoretical physicist, and the theoretical physicists are much more appreciated than the experimentalists. But of course, this is nonsense. No theoretical physicist can work without experimentalists which do the experiments. Otherwise, all theories are nothing if there are no experiments to show, to prove whether the theories are wrong or good. And in fact, the experimentalists, they are not less intelligent than the theorists, but they only have a different type of intelligence. Most theorists will not be able to perform real good experiments because that is also a specific sort of knowledge which you need for that. And if you relate this now to our problems, how we live in the world, then of course theoretical knowledge is only one part of what we need. We also need practical knowledge. And practical knowledge is for many of the things which we do and which we need to do much more important than theoretical knowledge. And if science concentrates on theoretical knowledge, this is of course a specific perspective on viewing reality, which somehow excludes this whole area of practical knowledge. What is related to this is that science goes for general knowledge, not for individual, for specific knowledge. Only generalities are important. General laws of nature are important, not the specific case. The specific case is only important to prove or to prove or not to prove the general law, but the real thing is the general knowledge, the law of nature, which can be gained. If you relate this to your everyday life, take as example relationships. If you would, for example, if you have the question, can I trust this person? If you look for a general law, whether you can trust this person, you will be lost. No relation will work out. You need to have some specific knowledge, and you need to trust your specific knowledge about this person. And in the whole of your life, very often you need specific knowledge, and you cannot relate this to generalities, to general laws. So this concentration on general laws is, of course, something which is important and which gives which expands our knowledge a lot, because science expands our knowledge a lot, but which also excludes a certain approach to the world, which is related to the specific situation now, to specific persons and to specific life situations, which cannot always be put under general laws. If you look at the process, how science gains knowledge, this has been analyzed by philosophers. Maybe you know Popper. Popper has pointed out a problem which was already known before in philosophy. This is the problem that observation is always only an individual observation. And even if you do the observation 100,000 times, it does not prove that there is a general law. If the sun rises today and tomorrow and again, that does not prove that it will rise every day. There is a logical gap when you gain general laws in science. This has been well analyzed, and this logical gap also points out that this concentration on general laws is also a specific form of perceiving reality, a specific perspective on reality. I said I'm talking also as a religious person. In religion, it is the individual case is very important. For example, why are the founders of religions considered important? Of course, because they give some teaching which is important, but also there is always some specific relation to that person. And I think this is another quality of knowledge which arises from such a specific relation to a specific person, which cannot be understood in a scientific worldview. So I go on with the next point. That is, in Greek philosophy, there was the slogan logos against mythos. So the old knowledge was considered to be mythos, stories about the world, and now philosophy wanted to come to logos, to rational knowledge. And mythos was considered to be irrational knowledge and subjective knowledge, while philosophy was considered to be objective knowledge. At that time in Greece, philosophy and science have not been separated. It has been the same. All great philosophers of Greece have also been scientists and mathematicians. What's the English word? Mathematicians, yes. So I'm not an English native speaker. So logos against mythos. Now, if you look at science in its pure form, for example in physics, and physics I think is somehow the core of science, then you have only formulas. Formulas tell you nothing about the world if you don't interpret what is in the formulas. You have to relate somehow the numbers in the formulas to something in the world. So already there you have something which is beyond this pure logos in that sense. You need some kind of interpretation. And it becomes much more important when you come to a scientific worldview. A scientific worldview is always a sort of interpretation. And very often scientists, when they claim that they have an objective worldview, while others only have subjective worldviews, they make interpretations without even noticing it, that it is an interpretation. For example, evolution is, in the beginning, it is a scientific theory. And I think we cannot doubt this theory. So though some religious person try to doubt it, but I think that is nonsense. It is a hard scientific theory, evolution. But what does it tell us about the world, the theory of evolution? There are some scientists who say this theory shows that humans are only some little like nothing in the universe. The whole universe is a big universe, and for a short time on this planet of Earth some humans are living and they will disappear, but they are not at all important in the universe. But this is not science, this is interpretation. And of course there are other interpretations which are possible about these scientific facts. You can also interpret it, you can also apply an interpretation that says all this universe somehow in this development of humans and probably of similar forms of life on other planets, all this somehow accumulates in this. This is somehow that which is the most important and the most significant in the universe. It's just a different interpretation, and you cannot decide which interpretation is the true one. But if you develop a worldview from science, then you cannot escape that you make an interpretation, and then you cannot escape subjectivity. And in that sense, the mythos cannot be excluded. You cannot only have logos, but you also need mythos in order to understand the world. And if we need mythos, I think it's also worth to relate to all the old myths of humankind and to look what truth is in this myth. The mythology of religions, but also mythology in a broader sense, which comes to us through the old mythology. Now it becomes more abstract. I try to make it short. Another point is science considers knowledge as information. It's information, and it considers information to be something objective. The term information has become very important in our days, of course, due to information technology, and there is an information theory which tries to grasp what information is. But if you look at this information theory, basically information is always based on communication. You cannot define information without a framework of communication in which this information is happening. I think it's easy to understand that you always need communication as a basis of information. And communication is, of course, something which happens between humans. It's not something objective. So the basis of this objective information is always communication. I think starting from that point, we can also make the point that communication is more important than information. And if you look at your life, of course, communication is always the basis. You cannot, many of our talking that we are doing during the day, if you look at it, what is the information in it? What is it? We just talk because we want to communicate, and that's okay, and that is good. Communication is more basic than information. When I come back to religion as one type of knowledge about the world, of course in religion it is always stressed that communication is more basic than information. There is no objective information that religions are transferring. Though sometimes they try to give this image, but I think that is a wrong conception about religions, that there is objective information about something like God or something like that. This information is always related to people communicating with each other, people telling stories about what they have experienced, and it cannot be separated from this communication. And this is one of the dangers of the scientific worldview, that it pushes us into a direction that we think all can be reduced to information, but that is not true. This communication and personal relation is much more basic than the information. Next point, scientific knowledge lives from formal representation. Everything is represented in a formal way. In order to be objective, it should be objective, and it should be written in a way that people can understand, independent of their culture and independent of the person who has written it. And that is a big quality, of course. For example, philosophy suffers a lot from the point that it is not possible to have such a formal representation. There is a big strain in modern philosophy which tries to formalize everything. I think it's nonsense. It doesn't work out well. And one can prove also that it doesn't work out well. I've published a paper on that it doesn't really work out well for philosophical problems. Not all what we know about the world can be really formalized. In fact, in mathematics, this has been proven also in some aspects, that formalization has its limits and is always depends on a broader form of human understanding whether mathematics is true or is not true. If you look at everyday life, and if you look at religion, what are our forms of telling and of learning about the world? It's not formal language, it is telling stories, and it is looking at images and all this. Many other types of communication which cannot be reduced to some formal representation. Another point, science relies on facts. Only factual knowledge can be the basis of scientific knowledge. Now this is a bit complicated. I would say not everything in our life are facts. In psychology, this is well known that people live their lives based on experience, but this experience are not pure facts. It's an experience which people somehow interpret in a specific way. And one of the approaches of psychology is that you can change these interpretations of facts in your life, and then the facts themselves somehow change. So, of course, when a fact is about a measurement result in physics, this cannot be changed. But the facts which are important for our life, they can be changed. And not all of reality can be reduced to pure facts which stand for itself. But these facts are interconnected with our form of perceiving these facts and of interpreting these facts. the last point, and this is a sort of also including everything, science is related to objects which are separated from the subject. The subject keeps out from experiencing the world. Of course, there is a subject that experiences the world, but the knowledge should be independent from the objects. So science lives from a very strict separation of subject and object. And I would say this is the basis, this is one of the basic elements and most fundamental element of this scientific worldview, that we consider the world as something which is objectively there, and we as observers, we just observe it, but the world does not depend on us. And of course, this excludes ourselves from the world. If we become part of the world, then this does not work out anymore. In fact, even in physics, you come to the limits of this type of knowledge. To explain it more deeply, I would need some hours, but in quantum mechanics, in some sense, you cannot find an objective world which is there. The world somehow only constitutes itself in the process of measurement. So in some sense, only when it is observed, the world comes into factual existence. Before that, it is only a world which has probabilities. You can only state probabilities, what can be measured in a specific situation. But when you measure, then facts arise, and then it becomes an objective world. So only in this connection of objectivity and subjectivity, only there the world arises. But this is not the important point. The important point is that, as I said, we live in a world where we are part of the world, and if we want to understand our place in the world and what it means for us to exist in this world, then we cannot take a position of objectivity. Then we as subjects are also important, and then we are beyond a scientific worldview. Of course, we can make ourselves an object of research. We can have electrodes put on our head and have measured what currents are there in our brain, but that's not what we experience. This does not give us any knowledge about how we experience the world, how we as subjects are in the world. This is a very different perspective. Of course, for human values, for anything like finding a sense of life, finding meaning in life, this subjective perspective and this subjectivity is basic. And if I come back to this question on how a religious worldview has its place also in a scientific world. Of course, in a religious worldview, this subjectivity is also very basic, and it's a sort of misunderstanding which can arise from the scientific worldview, that religious knowledge is simply objective knowledge. It is not objective knowledge, but this is not something which makes it worthless. I think it's important to understand that this objective knowledge is always based on subjects which live in the world, and therefore subjectivity is nothing bad, and subjective knowledge is not worse than objective knowledge. But in some sense, both types of knowledge are different perspectives of perceiving the world. So we can appreciate scientific knowledge, we can still use our mobile phones, which are based on scientific knowledge, and at the same time we can also cherish our everyday life approach to this world, which is cannot be reduced to this objective knowledge. So that was my thesis. Yeah, okay.